So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll still have some folks rolling in, and please feel free to grab some chai or samosa throughout the show because we've got plenty for all to enjoy. My name is Shannon Young, and I'm the manager of the Roundglass India Center. I know many of you may be looking for our director, Sheetal Kalantri, today, but Sheetal was in New York for a family wedding over the weekend, and today is in Washington, D.C. at the Diwali celebrations at the White House. So we could not compete with that, unfortunately. Sorry to say. I want to say welcome to the folks who are here in the room with us today, as well as the people who are joining us on Zoom. We have colleagues at the University of Washington South Asia Center who are Zooming in, as well as folks from the Roundglass Foundation. So welcome to them. This is a really special event, especially for me, and I think for Nalini Iyer, my colleague here, because we get to hear from the inaugural batch of faculty grant recipients from the Raman Family Faculty Grant Program. This program is the brainchild of Sheetal Kalantri, who really hoped to strengthen one of our center's main pillars of programming with this funding, which is to support cutting-edge research on India and Indian Americans. This program supports seasoned scholars of South Asian studies, as well as is here to encourage new faculty to branch into topics that are relevant to India. And I know some of you who are considering applying next year are here today with that interest in mind. So thank you for being here. Before I hand it over to Nalini and the faculty, I have several thank yous to make. The first is to thank Suri and Mala Raman for the gift that supports the center, as well as being ongoing advisors and supporters of all of our events. Thank you very much for joining us today and hearing about this faculty research. I also want to thank my colleague, Professor Nalini Iyer, who was the inaugural chair of the committee and helped to set up the guidelines to run this program for the full award cycle and set us up for future success for the remaining years. Thank you very much for that. As well as Matthew Isaac, who is the chair for 2025 and will pick up that torch and lead us into the next year of grant applications. Finally, I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Office of Sponsored Projects, and Director Jenna Isaacson, who's here with us today, as well as the Roundglass India Center staff, Stephanie Sanchez, who is working very hard at the podium to make sure all of the tech and the PowerPoint goes well for us today, and our very hardworking student support staff who make all of this possible as well. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand it over to Nalini to get us started.
Thank you, Shannon. Can folks hear me? Yeah, okay, great. I'm Nalini Iyer. I'm a professor in the English department, and as Shannon noted, it was my privilege to help structure this grant and chair the inaugural committee. I can't tell you how excited I am to hear these presentations because these proposals are fantastic. They show us the range and depth of scholarship that is very multidisciplinary on this campus and has been ongoing for many, many years. The folks here are specialists in this field, and I want to also take this opportunity to thank the Raman Family Foundation because supporting faculty research is something we're eternally grateful for. Faculty lack two things, time and financial resources. So you've given us that privilege. Thank you very much. So we have organized today in sort of two panels. The panel thing is mostly logistical. It's not they're all on the same topic or anything like that. And each speaker has been given 5 minutes. I'm sorry, has been given 5 minutes to summarize their work for a general audience. So our first panel will have the following speakers: Tapoja Chaudhary, Matt Isaac, and Sonora Jha. I'm going to introduce all of them so they can just kind of pick up and speak, and I don't have to interrupt. So the first speaker is Dr. Tapoja Chaudhary, who is an assistant teaching professor of anthropology and sociology, and her project title was Climate Change and Philanthropy, a focus on the Indian diaspora in the Pacific Northwest. Our second speaker, Dr. Matthew Isaac, who's the Thomas F. Gleed Chair of Business Administration in the Department of Marketing, His project, Cherished Numbers: Do Preferred or Auspicious Numerical Values Influence Marketplace Judgments in the United States and India? And the third speaker, Dr. Sonora Jha, Associate Dean for Faculty Scholarship and Academic Community, and also Professor of Communication and Media, and I'll add here, celebrated novelist as well. And her project is Intersections of Caste, Disability, and the Female Body. Female body in India, sorry. We will be doing the two panels back to back, and then there'll be room for comments, questions from our audience after. So, Tapoja, you're on.
Did you hear what I all said? And I know I'm rushing. It's like 5 minutes. I know, I know. Okay. So from 2004 to jump back to 2024, as we speak, these are some of the recent photographs of relief work done by Asha for Education in Mollarpur in West Bengal. And the point is that there's this kind of ongoing engagement with communities. There's a lot more floods, cyclones, heat waves, deforestation. In a nutshell, India is one of the most climate vulnerable, countries in the world, right? So how has fundraising been impacted by that? So not only just kind of, climate adaptation, but also I want to touch upon the concept of climate resilience. Like, how do we kind of make our communities, resilient to climate changes? And so again, kind of going back to some of the organizational works, I can think of like in 2010, when Association for India's Development had their annual aid conference at Deception Pass in the Pacific Northwest. And that was the first time when I heard about millet being talked about as a climate-resistant, drought-resistant crop, right? So aid has been working with that. And now recently, Bill Gates have discovered, millets as this amazing grain. And there's a lot of kind of conversation about what does it mean for marginalized communities in India in the context of climate change, right? So my point is just to give you the snippets of the kinds of work folks have been doing. So the next question is that all these organizations have been working with marginalized folks in India in environmental disasters and other situations. How does this translate into fundraising rhetoric? And of all the three different organizations that I'm looking at, I find Association for India's Development is the one that has the most robust incorporation of climate change rhetoric in their fundraising literature, they also have a whole series of little videos of climate resilience work with marginalized communities. It's available on YouTube. So that's, one of the things that has been going on. So, so all these kind of then informs my project, which is an ongoing one, is how did this language of climate change, climate adaptability, does it really kind of translate into communication with the Indian diasporic donor base? And theoretically, I'm coming from the understanding that philanthropic fundraising is always based on certain rhetoric, right? There's a certain hook, right? Whether it's women's empowerment, hunger, what have you. Why climate change? India is very climate vulnerable. All these nonprofits work in what I call frontline communities who bear the brunt of environmental degradation and climate change. Why Pacific Northwest? Because everyone is talking about climate awareness. City of Seattle is building climate pods or climate resilience pods in BIPOC communities. So there's a lot conversation going on. I find most of the donor base here in the Pacific Northwest, the Indian donor base is, they're mostly professional and educated. So I feel they're more aware of these, discourses all around us. Methods, I'm doing critical discourse analysis, which means I'm just kind of reading through all the annual reports, field reports, fundraising materials, going to fundraising events that are front facing, right? So that are facing the donors. That's what you see, right? So going through all these project reports that are available. And in a nutshell, till now, I haven't found any conscious mention of climate change, and that's astounding. It's beyond the scope, of this particular pilot project to ask the question why, but I did brainstorm with a long-time volunteer of one of these associations who also professionally works with climate justice and climate resilience work in Washington. So I kind of so she wears two hats, right? So I picked her brain. And one of the things that she said that the idea of climate resilience, right? It's not really relatable to many Indian diasporic donor base. So folks kind of think about climate change, sustainability in terms of kind of top-down measures, but not how do we kind of think in terms of maybe caste justice, right? Or gender justice and stuff. So that would be another project. So thank you. I try to keep it within 6 minutes.
Oh, thank you. I think I have some slides now. And we're going to see how I get through 10 slides in 5 minutes. So 30 seconds a slide here. So just as background, I'm a consumer psychologist. So you're going to, I think the diversity of the grants that you're going to see here is going to be you're going to see this here as this project is quite different. It's an ongoing project. It's on cherished numbers. And really it's my first work that's related to India. So I'm pleased to have this opportunity. Okay, so the starting point is, so I do a lot of work on numerical cognition, how we process numerical information. And key point is that numbers, of course, they communicate magnitude, but they do so much more. There are some symbolic associations that are associated with numbers that might be derived from, specific contexts and maybe socially learned. So, there's been research even linking things like odd numbers to masculinity, even numbers to femininity. Certainly in marketing and in business, we know the value of the number 9 as we see this being associated with things like value, discount, sales, that sort of thing. So there are these associations that occur. Additionally, numbers can serve as cognitive reference points. And so there's a lot of work that looks at anchoring, numerical anchoring, that's found evidence of this. So a classic example is if I ask you what the weight of a giraffe is, if I first ask you whether a giraffe weighs more or less than 800 pounds, and then I ask another group, does a giraffe weigh more or less than 2,000 pounds? And so you answer that question. And then I ask you, how much does a giraffe weigh? That initial anchor actually affects your judgment. Those who got the 2,000-pound question initially are going to end up with a higher estimate. So that's the idea of anchoring. In that case, the anchor might have meaning. You might think that the person asked this question in this way because it's an important reference point. But there's been work showing that even arbitrary anchors affect our judgment. So if you spin a wheel, a classic Tversky and Kahneman paper shows if you spin a wheel and you get an arbitrary number, it then might affect an estimate that happens later, including how much consumers say they're willing to pay for an item. So that's the idea of anchoring. It's a reference point that affects our subsequent judgment. There's been work showing that even when the number isn't presented to you, round numbers act as reference points. So they're kind of mentally always with us because we're so used to round numbers because of fives and tens, the number of fingers that we have, that sort of thing. So the work has shown, for example, that people are much more likely to retake the SAT if you score a 1290 than if you get a 1300. You know, even though that may not have been a goal per se, it's kind of this mental goal that you seem to have used, and it affects judgments. So I'm studying, what about favorite or auspicious numbers? Do these serve as some sort of mental kind of reference points that might affect marketplace judgments? And would we find this in India as well as in the US? And the starting point was actually, I saw this blog post where this convenience sample was conducted with 30,000 people, and the author found that basically just asked people what their favorite number was. And this was global, but largely leaning towards the US and Europe. And about 10% of people said that their favorite number was 7. And interestingly, about 50% of people said their favorite number was a single digit number between 0 and 9. Okay, so I'm going to focus on single digits here. And so I started out by first running a simple experiment. And the experiment really gave people information about workplaces. This is a list of best workplaces. They weren't familiar with these. And then I just asked them to evaluate how much better the workplace that was listed 7th on this list was compared to the workplace that was 8th. So they did this was an online study. They did this using a slider. So if you get a higher score, you can translate this to a 100-point scale. And if you get a higher score, that means that you think that 7 is much better. The 7th ranked company is much better than the 8th ranked company, right? And really, you shouldn't be affected by what your favorite number is for this purpose, because you're given this ordinal list of top items, and so that should really color your judgment. At the very end of the study, after some other filler questions, we asked people what their favorite single-digit number was between 0 and 9. So the finding, so I wanted to show you this is pretty, so on the right is what the favorite number breakdown was in my sample. About 34% had the number 7 as their favorite single digit number, which is higher than that other study, which was 10% times 2, so about 20%, because we're just narrowing on single digit numbers. But I also asked Claude, which is an artificial intelligence program, to do some synthetic data creation. And I asked them, well, what do you think that favorite single digit numbers are? And you can see they did not too badly. And that's what's shown on the left. So the main finding from this study was that participants whose favorite number was 7 kind of evaluated the number 7 item more favorably compared to the number 8 item, as compared to participants where it wasn't their favorite number. So it's interesting, like the basic idea is that favorite a number seemed to have skewed and influenced their judgments when they were deciding how much better or worse these items were on this list. And we think this could have some consequences for actual judgments. So where I'm going with this is I want to take this to Indian participants next and understand if we'll see some differences. This is what Claude tells me. I haven't done the survey yet, but Claude tells me that in India, we're likely to see more people choosing 8 as a favorite number, and potentially also the number 1, but 4 might be somewhat less, and you might be familiar with the reasons why that might be. So where I'm taking this next is to understand if these kinds of findings will show up in India versus the US, whether we'll see different patterns for negative associations, and whether this is idiosyncratic. Is it about my favorite number, or is it something that's more culturally learned about, the number 7 in the US or the number 8 in India? So that's where I'm going. And thank you to the Raman family for sponsoring this work.
Hi, everyone. I don't have a presentation, but I am happy to report I have a completed manuscript that I've just submitted to my editor for a new book that's coming out next year, in October next year, year from now. So the traditionally my scholarship, after years of doing traditional academic scholarship, I veered away into creative scholarship that is based on my academic research and also my journalistic work. So I was a journalist in India before coming to the US and getting my PhD and having an academic career. So I combine creative work with academic research and journalistic work as well. And so I landed on literary fiction as the manner in which I want to tell stories. And it's always been driven by what is the best way to tell this particular story? How is this particular story wanting to be told? And I think to me, literary fiction, its ability to cut across lived experiences and create empathy is something that I find very attractive. And so this new book is called Intemperance, and it's what started to happen with my last couple of books was that I started to think deeply about caste, something that I hadn't had to think about living in India and growing up in India because I was upper caste, right? The privilege of not having to address your caste privilege is deep, and so um, in speaking to several caste scholars here in the US and in India, people like Suraj Yengde, Yashika Dutt, Christina Dhanaraj, what their feedback was that if you're going to think about caste, rather than think about the suffering and the way it lands on Dalit communities, think about how it lands on you. And I think this is something that we can think about when it comes to whiteness in America and other kinds of oppressions, right? How does oppression land on the oppressor? What does it mean for their lived experience and their humanity? And so that was something I wanted to explore, and I started to see the connections between caste oppression and the oppression and the perceptions of disability, especially female disability in India. I grew up with polio and I had disabilities as a child that continue into adulthood. And so I started to explore that, looked at some of the work that has been done around that, because, I can't write a single word without actually doing all the academic research behind things, even if I'm writing creative fiction. So I was most drawn to feminist scholars and disability theorists who have stressed the need for examining the impact of, I cannot do this without my glasses, okay. I'm just trying really hard. The need for the impact of casteist patriarchy on public perceptions and mediated representations of the disabled female body. In her chapter, Negotiating Femininity, lived experiences of women with locomotor disabilities in Bengal, in the anthology Interrogating Disability in India, Theory and Practice in 2016, Nandini Ghosh discusses the pressures of presenting a feminine self that girls and women with disability experience under the prescribed gender culture of the disabled woman. So this is something that connected very strongly with my own lived experience, and I knew that somehow these perceptions of beauty and disability were linked to caste and ideas of who is disadvantaged, whether it's connected to a past life and your sins of the past life. This is Hinduism, and how to hide it. Like how do you hide your caste so that you can fit into the general culture and the privileges it offers, and how do you hide disability if it is something that can be hidden? And so that's something that I've explored deeply in my novel, and I was fortunate because of the grant to go to India and to go into Brahmarpur village in Bhagalpur district of Bihar and talk to my own ancestors and do some research there, and then also do archival research and conversations with with Dalit scholars here in the US, and also pay for sensitivity readers. The sensitivity reader, I think, is a really important phenomenon if you're writing about the lives and lived experiences of people whose experience is different from yours. And I found it very useful to get the feedback, go back into the research, deepen the work, and then come back. So the other thing with writing is that once you've done all the research and you have all this material, you have to, for creative writing and for fiction in particular, you then have to put it aside and write from thin air and devote yourself to the craft of writing. And that means taking some time off. So I was able to I had a sabbatical year last year, which was great. And I was able to take some time, lock myself up in a beautiful place and write. And so the book is complete, and we'll see what my editor has to say. But I think it's something I'm proud of and a little bit nervous about, because I am writing from the perspective of an upper caste woman. But this is something I can happily go back and forth and do more research and get back into. I don't know how long I took, but yeah, apologies if I went too long. Thank you.
All right, thank you to our first set of panelists. So we move now to the second one. Again, we have 3 speakers. Our first speaker in the second panel is Dr. Rashmi Chordia, who's Associate Professor of Public Affairs in the Nonprofit Leadership. And her project's called Liberatory Public Service in Action, Case Studies from the United States and India. The second speaker, Dr. Rebecca Cobb, is Clinical Professor in Couples and Family Therapy Program. And her project, Mokshapadam, Adaptation of an Ancient Indian Game for Culturally Relevant Teletherapy Intervention. And last but not least, Dr. Meenakshi Rishi, who is the Howard J. Bosanko Professor of International Economics and Finance in the Department of Economics. And her project was a keynote address at the Global Finance Conclave at Jindal Global University. Thank you. So, Rashmi.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm Rashmi Chordia. My pronouns are she and her. And this project, I think I have some animations I'll need. Oh, okay, cool. Thanks. So this project is titled Liberatory Public Service in Action, Case Studies from India and USA. I'll time myself. This project really builds on a recent book that I published. It's called Managing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Public Service Organizations. And in this book, we propose, my co-author Meghna Sabarwal and we propose a framework of how can we do equity work in the context of public service organizations that focus, whether it's government, nonprofits, but we also think this approach has broader and wider applications across different policy domains and across administrative factors. To really advance and do the equity work. So I'm at that stage where I need to advance the theory, do more research, and really build the practice, support building the practice or deepen its practice of liberatory public service. The word may be confusing. It's not a word we hear very often, so I just want to take a moment to actually talk about what is liberatory public service and why it matters. I'll talk about why it matters very briefly, going back to our recent example of COVID-19 or think about any social inequity, any type of social inequity. And often the way we approach is we really gear towards the middle and we forget about the margins. And in short, this framework is really uplifting and elevating social justice, other social justice frameworks that it builds on, and the idea that we, as public servants, especially in the government context, that is my domain of work in public administration, how are we cultivating a trauma-informed, like the trauma of oppression? We talked about disability and ableism and patriarchy and casteism. How do we address any of these problems without taking a trauma-informed repair? The repair needs to happen, centering the healing when healing needs are necessary. And while we do that as public administrators, we are actually following the leadership of those who are at the margins and those who are most impacted by the inequity. And these are not new ideas. This framework actually builds on a lot of different interdisciplinary frameworks especially grasp both critical academic scholarship, like it's frameworks of intersectionality, but also grassroots social justice movement frameworks like disability justice, healing justice, restorative justice, trauma-informed approaches, which built from grassroots to like now it's getting a lot more mainstream focus in different types of fields, and transformative justice. And so it's drawing on many different frameworks. And so what I want to do with this project, and this is the part where I'm in progress, because I really hope to take this to the empirical research level and use methodology that ideally like a mixed methods would have quantitative, but really if not quantitative, to start with case studies, qualitative, in-depth focus groups, interviews with people, choosing specific policy domains and specific programs. And so I'm at that identification stage, and I have identified collaborators in India, and I need to work on identifying collaborators or a good program in the US, but I'm in that identification phase. And so a program that I want to start with, especially in Indian context, is the Jivika. Anybody who's familiar with Indian context, this is one of the National Rural Livelihood Mission is one of the big policies that Indian government has launched. It's decades ago, and Jivika in Bihar state in India is one of the effective cases where this program has been successfully implemented and impacted millions of women and many different households through a bottom-up approach, where we have what we call in India self-help groups, but which are like collectives of women where they come together, microfinancing ways to like save money and also avoid the money lender trap. But this project has been quite successful. It's supported also by World Bank to build livelihood, to foster social empowerment, like women organizing and coming together to solve many different problems, from livelihood to poverty related to developing agriculture to addressing alcoholism and intimate partner violence, those type of problems too. So I will be identifying a project that would be more livelihood focused and exploring and comparing it with the US case study. And this is one that I've identified so far, but I'm still in that exploring stage. I need to speak to different, maybe like federal agencies or government officials to identify a good case study that would be good comparison. But this is one good example for now, like the tradeswomen building infrastructure. This is in the state of Illinois. They are trying to, this project, it received $1.3 million grant from the US government department under a bipartisan infrastructure bill. And this seeks to create pathways for women in non-traditional, like the construction industry, and especially focusing on Black, Indigenous, and women of color. So that seemed like a good comparison, but we will really be exploring it from the 5 principles. And this would be my last slide. 5 principles of liberatory public service. The font is small, but really the idea is, the first principle is about, are we integrating inner change and collective change? Often when we are doing change work or equity work, we want to focus on the policy and others. But this framework invites the administrator themselves to engage with their own inner transformation to actually do the work of centering the margins rather than centering themselves, or like those who are already in dominant powers, like how are we addressing biases, those type of things. Second is, the second principle is, it is being informed by the reality and the weight, really acknowledging that poverty comes with trauma, and it is the trauma of oppression, or it is intersectional. So it's historical, intergenerational, persistent, institutional. This is a language I'm borrowing from Resmaa Menakem, and personal trauma, but a lot of scholars have built this whole literature. Third principle is it repair and healing oriented? So are these programs taking these factors into account when they are being developed and implemented? The fourth principle is, are they compassionately centering the margins? How? If not, what can be done? The fifth principle is not just to reform, like really addressing the root causes of poverty. If we are thinking about alcoholism, it's not just like banning liquor, but how are we addressing root causes of alcoholism? And so really trying to transform the conditions that contributed to the harm to end that cycle of oppression and inequity. So I'll pause here for now and happy to answer questions. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Raman family, for the support. Appreciate it.
A timer for myself as well. Hi, I am Becky Cobb. At the time that the application for this grant came out, I was in the finishing stages of setting up all the chapters and identifying chapter authors for a book that I was working on called The Therapist's Notebook for Teletherapy with Children and Adolescents, Creative Interventions for Effective Online Therapy. And this book was essentially a place to gather really creative and innovative ideas for how to playfully and engage children, adolescents, and families in therapy via an online format. And again, the book was pretty much at a point where all of the different chapters were established already, but I saw this grant application come out and it made me wonder, is there an opportunity to include something in this book that would focus on something traditional to Indian culture? So I started doing a little bit of research, and I was looking at research that's out there on therapy for clients from India or Indian culture. And I found some, but I didn't find a lot specific to play therapy or therapy with children and adolescents. And I didn't find anything that was out there specifically on teletherapy interventions or for telehealth. I did find something, though, that was talking about the use of traditional Indian games in therapy and how those could be helpful in working with children and adolescents to facilitate the change process. One of the games that they mentioned was Chutes and Ladders or Snakes and Ladders, which was something that was familiar to me from my childhood. But in doing the reading, I saw that this game that I thought I knew about was actually rooted in ancient Indian tradition, originally called Mokshapatam. And so I started researching this. Normally, when I was a child playing this game, it was really about who can get to the top of the game board the fastest, who can win this game. And there wasn't a whole lot behind it in terms of what the meaning of the symbols on the board meant or what it meant to get to the top first, besides just winning the game and beating the people that you were playing with. But what I realized is that the original variation of this game was really rooted in a spiritual tradition, practice, and journey, with the ladders going up being virtues that each represented something significant in a spiritual way or in terms of virtues in life. And the snakes going down the board represented vices or things that would keep you from ascending in a spiritual path. This made me think about how this game could potentially be used in a way that wasn't just about being playful in therapy, but could actually facilitate conversations about the ups and downs of life, about the virtues that help you in life, and in one's spiritual journey. However, I myself do not know a whole lot about Indian culture and tradition. And so I thought that in applying for this grant, I could hire a student research assistant who maybe knew more about this than me. So I was so grateful and so lucky to have this grant to be able to hire Simi Upal, who is here right now, and who actually is the first author on this chapter that is now completed and finished, to where we were able to really detail the specifics of what this intervention might look like in teletherapy using a virtual version of the game, or actually creating a version of the game that could be played just taking a photograph of a game board and making your own pieces in a computer program, and coming up with some really specific processing questions on things like navigating the ups and downs of life, overcoming adversity, progressing towards therapeutic goals, and processing the karmic journey. And Simi wrote a really beautiful vignette on this in using this intervention with a first-generation Indian Canadian family. So we're really excited about this chapter. I think it adds something that isn't out there already, and really was able to bring in a topic focusing on Indian culture into a book that, in all honesty, I don't think this chapter would have happened and it wouldn't have made its way into this book had this grant not been out there and had not inspired this project. So the book is almost done. It will be submitted to Routledge, our publisher, at the end of the year. But the chapter is already complete, and to me, it looks really good. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mala and Suri and the Raman Family Foundation for funding my trip to Jindal Global University. They had a global finance conclave, so I was asked to keynote. The title is self-explanatory. And also while I was there, I did do a guest lecture in a macroeconomics class, which is this better? So I did a guest lecture in a macroeconomics class for Dr. Ruchira Sen, and that was on structural inequities in the US macroeconomy. And that did not make it to this because I have 38 slides. So I'm just going to go very quickly. Very quickly, I actually discussed what India, in the first few slides, about what India's pride, where India's pride comes from, very enviable GDP growth rates, financial inclusion, which is a area of research. I must also thank my graduate assistant, Aditi Somani, for helping me gather all the data and make some sense out of the data that was going to be compiled for this note. We talked about, I talked about the unified payments interface, the UPI system. Also talked about how global growth is going to come down. Mumbai has having more billionaires than any city after New York and London. I did not know that. Delhi itself ranked 9th. What I focused on initially was what I called the HIND model, HIND, standing for the new model of economic development in India. H for Hindutva, I for infrastructure focused, N for national pride, and D for democracy, or other governance indicators. So let me go down to some of the so basically while GDP growth rates in India are enviable, in fact, India's economy is expected to surpass Germany and Japan and only be number 3. And there's some doubt whether it's going to be 3 or 2 after US and China. Any student of economics knows that it's not the rate of growth sometimes, but it's also the level and what you're using as a denominator. So GDP per capita in India, when India is not even in the top hundreds. So that was something that I focused on with some data. Let me go forward to the slide number 12. I think so I talked about how India's GDP is not as dependent on exports as it should be. We had some slides on the value of manufactured exports. Manufacturing is a big lacuna in the component-wise GDP growth in India. And in fact, we got some data that said the value of manufactured exports as a share of GDP has stagnated in the Indian economy at about 5%, which is curiosity because if you compare it, and there were some slides on that, if you compare it to other developed nations, their GDP growth rates have achieved in the Indian growth rate at a stage when manufacturing was actually rising, whereas India's manufacturing exports have really stagnated. And so that was one of the areas of concern that we highlighted in the concept report. I also focused a little bit about, I called it the Goldilocks economy that India was in, but we also talked that there were not just 3 bears, but several bears that were going to scare Goldilocks unless, she acted differently. And one of the bears was poverty and rising income inequality. And this slide got a lot of discussion afterwards, but Thomas Piketty, has done some work on India, which many scholars at Jindal Global debunked very soundly, but I was able to cross-debunk them. They were talking about, Piketty report says that between 2014 and 22-23, India's wealth concentration has been particularly, the inequality in the wealth concentration has been particularly stark and very high and very historic levels. And actually, Piketty's research says that the Indian tax system is regressive. At the Jindal conclave, the person who came after me was a tax expert, and he agreed with me. So both of us were able to launch a counterattack on those that questioned our data. And in fact, if any of you have seen the prenuptials and then the nuptials of the Ambani family, you might agree with me. We also focused on what are some of the causes, the structural causes for income inequality in India. And wages and earnings are declining. There's been a upward trend of casual labor, but real wages of those registered workers have actually stayed stagnant or in fact declined. Self-employment and real earnings of self-employed workers have also declined. And so that's sort of one of the big bears is unemployment. And that has, I'll just go past this slide 18. So we did talk about the labor force participation rate in India. So labor force participation is the percentage of the working age population that is either working or looking for work. And India's labor force participation rate has actually started to go down. In fact, if you break it down by age and by gender, the results are even more stark. Youth unemployment or youth labor force participation rates are of grave concern, even to the policymakers, and women's labor force participation rates. So in fact, I have some data on India's youth unemployment. So this is the age group in India is like 15 to 24. This is a very high unemployment rates and very, as labor force participation is going down. And in fact, when you break down the data on youth, young women who are not in education are neither in employment or in trading. And that's sort of one of the concerns on the reports that we looked at. There's been a lack of youth employment. So a lot of the youth are migrating back to agriculture. And that seems to be of concern because students of economic history know that, it proceeds the other way. Agriculture, manufacturing, services, exports. And in India, the trend that started during the pandemic of youth migrating back to the villages during COVID has actually resulted in them just staying there. So there were some slides that discussed this thought for concern in rural areas. And then I think maybe I'm running out of time, but we did talk a little bit about female labor force participation rates and gender imbalance in India's labor force. And female labor force participation rates in India are India's labor force participation is 28%. Even Bangladesh has better labor force participation rates for women. Of course, China has a rate of 60% female labor force participation rate. Now, the newest data that came from India says, no, your data are wrong because there's been a rise in labor force participation, but they're actually counting unpaid domestic housework. And I wish they would start counting all unpaid work because then, maybe we would get better data. The other thing I focused on, and I think I might just stop with that, is financial inclusion. This is an area of research for me. Account ownership in India has doubled. From 35% to 78% between 2011 and 2021 because of a big push by the government of India to create new accounts. But we find out that that's sort of the supply. They just keep making accounts, almost like what Wells Fargo was doing here, just creating accounts, right? And there's nothing in those accounts. The women are actually they don't even know there's been accounts. Some of them anecdotally don't know that there's accounts opened in for them. And so 35% of these opened accounts are actually inactive. I did ask the Consul General who was here for a talk last month about what's being done to include women in the use of financial services and access to credit. And he gave me a very good answer, but I'm going to wait for the data to come out. So inactive bank accounts and women not knowing what to do with money is sort of an area of concern. And that's something that we're working on. I'm working on even for the United States. And I think, how much time do I have, Nalini? Because I can just, I'm out. I am out of time, but please talk to me if you're interested in more of this. And as I said, 38 slides. Thank you.
All right, that was absolutely fascinating, and floor is open for our audience questions, comments, anything. Do you want to use the mic? Yeah, because we have people online. If someone wants to ask a question or comment, we'll pass you a mic. Panelists, you can talk to each other too.
Question per se for any particular person and all the research is fascinating, but I must say, like, kudos to all of you for covering your extensive work in 5 minutes. I know that really did appreciate hearing, and I mean, I have questions for each one of you, but we could do it offline.
Okay. Yeah.
So first of all, thanks everybody for your presentations. My question specifically is Sonora. I think when you sort of talked about centering between the oppressor and the oppressed, and you sort of initially thought about sort of maybe a more traditional approach looking at the oppressed, but then you got this idea of looking at it from the perspective of somebody who's got maybe a more sort of centered identity traditionally. But then you went into the intersections that actually looked at oppression. And so I'm just curious how you feel that the experience of going away from a purely oppressed centric approach, even with intersectional dimensions, versus an approach that looked at oppressed and oppressor, and then took the intersectionality. What were your sort of just experiences going through that as compared to maybe a traditional approach that centers the oppressed?
Yeah, that's a great question because, thinking of myself as the storyteller and as the person with of different experiences and intersectional experiences, it was really interesting. Like, where was I able to tease out the privileges that I had as a Brahmin woman, as compared to a woman growing up in India with polio, and then as a woman of color in the US, right? That was an interesting piece to see, like, where did privilege come into my life. And then so this is what fiction allows, and this is the thing that I really love, right? Because I'm able in fiction to inhabit these different perspectives. I mean, my last novel I wrote entirely from the point of view of a white man, and so to be able to imagine the position of the person with power, and to imagine it with their vulnerabilities as well, and their all the things that they experience that brings them to not question their power, right? And the way society and structures hold those things up. So I don't know if there's a direct answer to yours, but I think it's in the process of imagining and research, between imagination and research, and being able to inhabit different perspectives that I find pure gold in terms of writing, and then to take that back and also give it to the people who, both the people in power and the oppressed, right? And say, does this speak to it? Does it at least come close to something that you've experienced? And one of the most interesting things to me, if I may, was my conversations with my father, who grew up even earlier as a Brahmin male, never questioned, was extremely oppressive and violent. Okay, the conversations I had with him in trying to get him to remember his village experience growing up as a boy in the village, and what were his encounters with people that they had certain names. What were the encounters, and seeing the dawning on his face, even on FaceTime across these oceans, right? Seeing the dawning on his face of the oppression that he had unwittingly bought into was really powerful. And so keeping that expression and those words in my mind and bringing that onto the page was some places where I was able to do this.
Thank you. I've got my eye on the clock, and I know, Matt, you want to talk about the upcoming grant cycle. So
Yes. So First of all, thanks to everyone. I wanted to just make sure to invite all of you to encourage applications for these grants have been, I think, transformative in helping us pursue some of our work. And we'd like to see the pool continue to expand. So really think about, if you're faculty in this room, if you have work that might fit in, even if it's broadly related to India, like some of my work, are there ways that you can kind of connect? In the social sciences, for example, there's a lot of work suggesting that a lot of our research uses weird samples, which are Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic subjects. And so even taking some findings that we might have found in with these samples and trying to understand if that extends to Indian participants could be useful. So I would encourage the same sort of thing in your own discipline to see if there's some untapped opportunities. So please spread the word widely. I think our deadline is Friday, January 3rd, and we'd really like to expand beyond just the faculty that are already affiliated with Roundglass to some of our peers across the university. It's a great idea. So Shannon might be able to help me with that. Should be on the website, right?
The faculty will pose you with the university photographer who's here, as well as the Raman family, we made together for our records. But thank you again for joining us today.